And another judge that's not really in the book of Judges, but is a judge, is Samuel. And we'll talk about all that eventually. So if we were going to cover this in totality, we would be starting in the book of Judges. We'd be moving through 1st and 2nd Samuel, then 1st and 2nd Kings, which also would include 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And we talked about the difference between Kings and Chronicles. We talked about the similarity. Eventually we'll get to that. So the pattern that we need to look out for throughout the book of Judges, and I would say throughout all of human history, is people forget God. God allows people to be punished, right? So he lets another group of people come in and punish them. So he turns them over to their enemies. In the book of Judges, God's going to raise up a judge. This military leader is going to throw off this yoke of oppression. They're going to say, yay, this is great. We love you, God. And then in a short period of time, they forget God and the pattern repeats. Yeah, now you got me coughing. All right. The other thing we want to remind everybody is when we talk about the judges, I know growing up, when I studied the book of the Judges or studied any judge, there was always this idea that one came to power like a king. You can't have more than two kings reigning at once. One's a judge, then he dies or leaves, and somebody else becomes a judge. But we actually know from studying this, there are judges who are ruling concurrently in different parts of Israel. That's important to remember because sometimes we read this, we think, oh, Gideon's over everybody. Well, that may or may not be true. There may be another judge in another part of Israel. This is really a fragmented period in the history of the Jews. While they were the nation of Israel, they really didn't think of themselves as the nation of Israel as much as they saw themselves as a collection of clans. And you even see this in the story of Gideon, because when Gideon talks about his family, he doesn't even talk about himself from the tribe he's from. He talks about himself from the sub-clan he's from, the Bezurites. So it's really a very clannish period. There is no national unity per se. Kind of everybody, I think the Judges says everybody did what was right in their own eyes. So this is the kind of period that we're in right now as we're getting ready. We are dealing with Gideon, and Gideon is right here. We're going to see Gideon and Abimelech. Okay. We won't talk about this. We did talk about Megiddo because of the significance in many of the stories in the book of Judges. This was the chart I meant to show you last week, but I couldn't get the presentation to work for me. And again, all this material will go out after today. I'll send out lesson 2, the PowerPoint slides, and the lesson plan so you'll have it. And then last week we talked about this ephod. So why is this picture significant to our story in Gideon? Who remembers? That's right. So after their defeat of the Midianites, we find out a large portion of the army of the enemy was Ishmaelites. Ishmaelites being the descendant of Abraham and Keturah. You remember Ishmael was sent away. He wasn't the son of promise. They had a bunch of earrings, apparently. A lot of gold jewelry. I think it was 1,700 shekels. We talked about just how much weight that would be. It would have been a massive amount of gold. And that Gideon takes that gold and he turns it into an ephod. A lot of debate over exactly what constitutes an ephod, so let's be clear on that. But generally speaking, the ephod is this garment that the breastplate was attached to. It would have had hooks. If you go back and read Exodus, there have been rings on the shoulders, and that's where the breastplate would have connected. The breastplate had precious stones or semi-precious stones representing each of the 12 tribes. But it would have signified something important. If you were a Jew living in the days of the Judges and somebody took and created a golden ephod, what should that take you back to in your mind? That's right, not the king, but the high priest. Remember, they wanted to make Gideon a king. He says, no, I'm not going to be your king. God is your king. But he almost takes on the mantle of this high priest role, which is interesting because what he's staking out as a claim is that while I may not be the ruler over Israel, I've got this exclusive one-way relationship with God, and you need to work through me if you're going to get to him. And so we're at the end of chapter 8, Judges chapter 8. If you want to turn there, that's where we're going to start. Yes, ma'am. In ancient times, the whole purpose of a king was to lead their people into battle. which is why the story of David and Bathsheba is so shocking, because David shouldn't have been home in his palace, bored, looking for temptation. He should have been on the front lines with his men. So yes, in ancient times, a king was primarily supposed to be leading the troops.
So how did we get from kings to judges? Like how did we end? I don't remember how the last king ended, and then how long was it before they had judges?
There are no kings yet. We're getting to the kings. Judges come before kings. So the idea of a judge is a judge has a subordinate role to God, right? So God is the leader, he's the ruler, he's the king. And then you have these judges that God appoints, not you, God appoints for a period of time to do a specific work. And when his work is done, he's done. There's no hereditary rule. That's a big differentiator between a judge and a king. When you get to kings, there's this idea of hereditary, right? So David had sons. There was even an inner family war over who was going to succeed David. When Solomon is anointed king, his brothers across town self-appointing himself king, right? So there is this idea that I am the descendant of David, therefore I have a legitimate claim to the throne. In the Judges, this really doesn't happen except for what we're going to study today. So when we get to Gideon and the end of chapter 8 going into chapter 9, we're going to find this idea of a king hereditary rule starts to creep in. So they go to Gideon, they say, we want you to be our king. He says, absolutely not. God is your king. But I believe reading this and the fact that he created a golden ephod would have been this hearkening back to this idea of a high priest. So he's putting himself in a significant place in the eyes of the Israelites. And the writer of the book of Judges puts Gideon there. I mean, in many places he talks about what Gideon has done, the significance of what he's done. We get to chapter 9, he's going to make the accusation that the Israelites forget what Gideon has done, which is kind of the beginning of the problem for them. Okay, so there's this golden ephod. It becomes an entanglement and a snare not only to Gideon and his family, but also to the Israelites. They begin to worship the object instead of worshiping God, which is a common problem with humanity. We do that today. We just don't stick gold idols up. We do it through our jobs, our careers, our hobbies, our possessions. Okay, so end of chapter 8. Go to verse 29. We're going to read verses 29 through 35. Somebody read that, please.
Then Zerubbabel, the son of Joash, went and dwelt in his own house. Gideon had 70 sons who were his own offspring, for he had many wives. And his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, whose name he called Abimelech. Now Gideon, the son of Joash, died at a good old age and was buried in the tomb of Joash his father in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. So it was, as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children of Israel began again played the harlot with the Baals, and made Baal Berith their god. Thus the children of Israel did not remember their Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hands of all their enemies on every side. Nor did they show kindness to the house of Zerubbabel, Gideon, in accordance with the good he had done for Israel.
All right, so if you weren't here previously, it gets confusing because they use this term Zerubbabel and Gideon. Somebody remind everybody, who is Zerubbabel and what does that mean? What's that? That's right, one who contends with Baal, because remember, he was the one who tore down the altar to Baal, his father's altar, and the people came to him, they wanted to kill him, and Gideon's father says, what business is of yours? If it's a problem with Baal, Baal will deal with this, and at that point he changed his name to one who contends with Baal. So Zerubbabel is Gideon. It's the same person. So I know they use that term interchangeably through this section. It's the same person. So we find out in verse number 29 that after all of this fighting with the Midianites, after he wins and he creates this ephod, he goes and dwells in his own house. And it says he has 70 sons because he had many wives. Now, when you read these stories, you need to remember there's these echoes that happen throughout other stories. Who does this remind you of? Solomon, that's right, Solomon. That's exactly what I thought of when I heard this. Solomon had tons of wives and tons of concubines. Did that help Israel in the long run or create problems for Israel? Yeah, it's going to create problems. So we know that Gideon is wealthy and powerful. We know he's wealthy because he has many wives and many children. Those things take money. For those of you who don't believe us, if you have more than one child, it takes a lot of money, even if you have a child. So he has a lot of money. He's a very powerful person, and he has a lot of offspring, 70 children. Now, it tells you in passing, almost parenthetical, that he also has a child through a concubine. What is a concubine? Let's talk about what that is.
There was also someone who, I don't know if we could say that she was promised to him, but someone who of lesser status than the wife, usually by their possessions, by their, I guess, material things that they had.
Yeah, so the way I would put it is the man had all the rights of a husband with the woman. The woman had none of the rights of a wife with the man. So she was subordinated. She was basically almost a servant, a little higher than a servant, because she usually would have her own place to live and she would have money herself. And then through her children, that was really her blessing. A concubine was blessed through her offspring. So he has a concubine. It tells us that she has a son. The son is Abimelech. Guess who we're going to talk about in chapter 9? A man by the name of Abimelech. So the story sets up, you have a son born to a minor wife, right? So he's probably already got a chip on his shoulder, already feels a little inferior, and there's 70 brothers. How many people here have grown up in a family of more than one child? Is there competition with siblings? I can tell you, there's three of us, two brothers, and we competed all the time. It got to a point where if one did one thing, the other brother was not going to do it. Like, I played football, so Sean was not. He was the basketball guy. And because I was football, Sean was basketball, Nathan had to be soccer, because if we all played the same sport, we'd always constantly be comparing ourselves to who was the best at whatever we were doing. There's always sibling rivalry. So there's 70. Do you think Abimelech feels a little bit of this competitiveness with his siblings? Well, we're going to find out he does. So chapter 9, coming quickly. So he's got a big family. He's got lots of sons. He dies. He's buried. And as soon as he's buried, his body's probably not even cold in the grave. The Bible tells us they do what? They go, some translations say, a whoring. A whoring. Okay, what is it when the Bible talks about spiritual, you used a different term, what was it? Adultery? Adultery, whoring, same thing. What does that mean? When God uses that term in relation to himself and his people, what is he saying? Yep.
And it's basically along the same principle. We leave Christ to worship some idol god, and that's primarily the same principle, what we would be doing.
Right, just like with our spouses, our bodies are not our own, they belong to our spouses. So by using our body with another person, it is unfaithfulness. Spiritually speaking, we do not belong to ourselves, we belong to God. We're in a faithful, committed relationship with God, and when we go with other gods or other religions, we commit spiritual adultery or spiritual whoring. Right in line with the pattern we've already seen, right? They're released of their bondage, things are good, they turn their back on God, they go back to Baal, which ironically is who they were worshiping when the story of Gideon began. Remember, he tore down the altar to Baal, and that's why his name was Jerubbaal. Okay, so we got the situation where they turned back on God. They remembered not the Lord their God or delivered them out of the hands of their enemy. Neither showed they any kindness to the house of Jerubbaal, namely Gideon, according to all the goodness that he had showed unto Israel. That's a big statement, because what's going to happen in chapter 9 is tragic would not be a word that gives enough weight to what happens in chapter 9. I mean, it is truly a repudiation of everything that Gideon stood for and for what God had done for them. Okay, so chapter 9. Let's leave it here. All right, chapter 9. So we get to chapter 9, and we see the story really begins at the end of chapter 8. We know that Abimelech has this big family. Israel forgets God and Gideon and what he's done for them. And then we start in chapter 9. Somebody read Judges chapter 9, verses 1 through 3. Judges 9, 1 through 3.
Then Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal, went to Shechem, to his mother's brothers, and spoke with them and with all the family at the house of his mother's father, saying, Please speak in the hearing in the hearing of all the men of Shechem, which is better for you, that all 70 of the sons of Jerubbaal reign over you, or that one reign over you. Remember that I am your own flesh and bone. And his mother's brothers spoke all these words concerning him in the hearing of all the men of Shechem, and their heart was inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, He is our brother.
Okay, so Abimelech, the son of a concubine, goes to his mother's country, or his mother's place of origin, which we know is what? Shechem. Okay, which is a significant city in this time. A lot of things happen in and around Shechem throughout the entire book of Judges. So he goes to Shechem, and his statement is what? Do you want 70 kings or one king? Do you want 70 kings that aren't related to you, or one king that is related to you? What's implied in that? What to put yourself in the Shechem? If you make that plea to me, what are you saying to me? You can have 70 people who aren't you, part of your family, your blood, your kind, or one king who is. Who are you going to take care of? You're going to take care of us, right? It's self-serving on their part because they feel like, hey, this is a guy who's flesh of our flesh, blood of our blood, bone of our bone, and we can deal with him. He's one of us. He's going to take care of us. So the people advocate for him and say, yeah, we should probably follow Abimelech because he is one of us. Now, they're rejecting the 70 sons of Gideon, and they're going to follow the one son born to Gideon and his concubine. Now, this is going to set a stage for a huge tragedy for the Israelites in chapter 9. So this is going to start an internal civil war, and we're going to see it's really bad. So that's the stage that's set. Gideon is dead. Abimelech is ambitious. He goes to his family. He says, back me. If you back me, I'll back you. Okay, everybody follow me so far? So then we also, just take your finger and slide down. What happens in Judges 9:6 from this statement? Then all the men of Shechem and Beth Millo assembled together, and they went and made Abimelech king by the oak of the pillar, which is in Shechem. And if you take your finger and slide down to verse 22, now Abimelech ruled over Israel for 3 years. So Abimelech's strategy worked. He becomes king, and he's going to rule in their stead. Now we're going to find out how he does that. Just because Shechem makes him king doesn't make him king yet. So let's go to verses 4 and 5. Somebody read that, please. Now that you are king, Abimelech, now that you're going to take care of us, here's what happens. Okay, so now that you're king, Abimelech, we're going to give you something. What do they give him?
Money.
How much? They give him 70 pieces of silver. To me, it kind of reminds me of the story of Judas betraying Jesus, right? He's paid off with a certain number of coins. And that purse is to help him go hire an army. So interesting that people don't voluntarily follow Abimelech. They have to be paid mercenaries. They're going to go do a brutal thing. So he has these followers. The Bible calls these men worthless and reckless fellows. And then they go to Ophrah. Now, let's talk about this for a minute. If Abimelech is king, the capital is where? Shechem or Ophrah? Shechem. Okay, you have a business in Shechem. Do you benefit from the capital moving from Ophrah to Shechem? Of course you do. One of the great debates we had in this country was where the capital was going to be. It was Philadelphia, then it was New York City, and then it was Washington, D.C., and there was a lot of fighting over the movement each time because people were losing financially in that situation. So the people of Shechem realized that by Abimelech becoming king, the capital moving from Ophrah to Shechem is going to benefit them. It's going to shift power and wealth to Shechem and not Ophrah. They send him with a hired army. Interesting that nobody from Ophrah says, here, I'll go with you. I'll pay for you to go get somebody. And they go to Ophrah, and what happens? They kill 70, it should be 70 men except for Jotham. Jotham's the only survivor.
Which means 69 they killed.
Yes, 69 they kill, and they kill him apparently in a mass execution. They take him to a particular stone, one after the other, they kill him. Now, when Gideon dies, he feels like he's in a very good, safe and secure place. I mean, men here will probably tell you that as we start to age, we start to think of our legacy more and more. We don't think so much of legacy when we're in our 20s because we're invincible, we're going to live forever. There's so much life in front of us. As we get into our 50s, we start to realize, wait a minute, there's less in front of me than there is behind me. When I die, what are people going to remember, right? So your children and your grandchildren start to take more and more prominence because they are your legacy. Gideon had a huge legacy, and one day, what happened? He goes from 71 offspring to 2. To 2. And one is trying to kill the other. Okay. So now the interesting thing is it tells us that Jotham, the youngest, is able to hide, and he survives, which means there is this lingering legacy from the legitimate line of Gideon. Abimelech would have been, well, not illegitimate, but less legitimate. And what's interesting is what Jotham does next. So he doesn't just run away and hide. We're going to find out verses 7 through 21 that he is going to, once he gets to a safe distance, he's going to give them a speech or a prophecy. And we're going to find out that this is a foretelling of what's going to happen through the chapter. So somebody read verses 7 through 21.
Now when they told Jotham, he went to sit up on top of Mount Gerizim and lifted his voice and cried out, and he said to them, listen to me, you men of Shechem, that God may listen to you. The trees once went forth to anoint a king over them. And they said to the olive tree, reign over us. But the olive tree said to them, should I cease giving my oil, with which they honor God and men, and go to sway over trees? Then the tree said to the fig tree, you come and reign over us. But the fig tree said to them, should I cease my sweetness and my good fruit, and go to sway over trees? Then the tree said to the vine, you come and reign over us. But the vine said to them, should I cease my new vine, which cheers both God and men, and go to sway over trees? Then all the trees said to the bramble, you come and reign over us. And the bramble said to the trees, I am in truth, if in truth you anoint me as king over you, then come and take shelter in my shade. But if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon. Now, therefore, if you have acted in truth and sincerity in making Abimelech king, and if you have dealt well with Zerubbabel and his house, and have done to him as he deserves, for my father fought for you, risked his life, and delivered you out of the hand of Midian. But you have risen up against my father's house of this day, and killed his 70 sons on one stone, and made Abimelech, the son of his female servant, king over the men of Shechem, because he is your brother. If then you have acted in truth and sincerity with Jerubbabel and with his house this day, then rejoice in Abimelech, and let him also rejoice in you. But if not, let fire come from Abimelech, and devour the men of Shechem and Beth Millo. And let fire come from the men of Shechem and from Beth Millo, and devour Abimelech. And Jotham ran away and fled. And he went to here?
Mhm.
And he went to there and dwelt there for fear of Abimelech his brother.
Now, this takes a lot of courage. So you're running, you've hidden, you've avoided a massacre. Your brother's bodies are probably still laid on the ground and blood is everywhere. You go up to Mount Gerizim where you can see them, which means they can see you. You are speaking where they can hear you, which means you can hear them, right? So you're not too far away. There is still some ability, which means they probably could catch you if they really wanted to pursue you. Instead of fleeing, he turns and gives this speech. And it's a masterful speech. He gives a story about descending orders, right? So he says these oak tree, these great people, they go and they decide they want a king, and the first thing they go to is what kind of plant? An olive tree, which would have been very significant to people in this part of the world. Would have been one of like, what's the word I'm looking for? Not a core crop, but a staple crop, right? Something they used for everything. They say, hey, be our king. And he says, I'm too busy doing what I do. I can't be your king. And they go through this descending order. Then it's a fig tree. Fig tree says, I got important work. I don't have time for this. And then it goes from the fig tree to the vine. Now, interesting, it goes from trees, right? And then it gets to a vine. So a vine has to use the trees really to prop itself up. But they said, no, I'm too busy because I'm doing what I do. I produce grapes. That's more important than ruling over you. So they go all the way through this list, and the last thing they get through is a bramble, also a vining plant. Anything useful from a bramble? I haven't found a useful purpose for bramble. Matter of fact, usually when it is used, it's used to discipline somebody else. Like when we saw the story of Gideon, and he went back to Penwith and Succoth, right? He took the brambles and he whipped them with it. Gordon.
You know, what I found interesting in reading all that is that the very strategy that Abimelech used to sway the people to become king, now that strategy is reversed. It's the same, but it's opposite of what Abimelech did. And to me, what made it the more interesting is when, what was his name?
Abimelech?
Son?
Oh, Jotham.
Jotham. He calls Abimelech's mother a servant.
Yep.
And I think by that it gave his speech more power because of that. I mean, I'm just reading into it. Why else would he say that?
Well, he absolutely is trying to draw their hearts to him.
So
If you loved my father, then you would love me more than you'd love Abimelech.
Right.
I'm the legitimate heir. He's not.
But isn't his mother's family Shechem?
That's right. So that was the other point I was going to make.
And it could have went the opposite way and totally
Alienated?
alienated them from Shechem.
So I think there's two people he's talking to here throughout this speech. There is the people of Shechem, and he certainly is painting this diminishing line to say, you chose the worst person you could follow. But then he's also talking, I think, to the people of Ophrah, right? When he says to them, hey, where is it? I just lost it. I'm the legitimate heir, not them. Because remember, they didn't destroy Ophrah. They destroyed the 69 sons of Gideon. Those people are still there. So maybe you're trying to call their hearts and their passions up to rise up for you. And then I think there is this last part, he's speaking to both. The last part he says, okay, I want to ask you a question. If you think that you have done right, then you should go and rejoice in it. But if you've done wrong, this is where the curse comes. If you've done wrong, a fire is going to come out of Abimelech and destroy you. And that fire is also going to come out of you and destroy Abimelech. It'll be mutually destructive, this relationship. So I think in that case, he's talking to both groups of people. But he takes it, to me, it shows a lot of courage for you to be this young man who just watched this massacre, to turn around and speak this boldly to the people who could pursue you and kill you. And I think he does a masterful job the way he walks through this. I mean, if you were listening to this speech, you'd remember it. It has very visual pictures of the trees in the descending order of the plants. And then he makes a very passionate point at the end of this. If you want somebody to rule you, wouldn't you have chosen a legitimate heir as an illegitimate heir? And in your heart of hearts, you know what you did was wrong, because you're not going to rejoice in this. This is going to be to your demise. So this statement sets up the rest of the chapter. This is it. If you remember this, everything that happens makes sense, because this is foretelling the ultimate outcome of them choosing poorly. Okay, so Abimelech is going to reign over them. We know that they reign over in Israel for 3 years in verse 22. But then God is going to allow the fruit of the fruit of their sin to come to ripen here. So we're going to go to Judges chapter 9, verses 23 through 25. Somebody read that, please. Judges 9, 23 through 25.
God sent an evil spirit between Amalek and the lords of Shechem. Did someone pronounce it?
Men of Shechem.
Shechem, and treated Amalek deceitfully, so that the crime against the 70 sons of
Jerubbaal.
might come to justice, and their blood would be avenged on their brothers-in-law, who killed them, and on the lords of Shechem, who had helped him kill his brothers. The lords of Shechem rebelled against him by putting people on the tops of the mountains to ambush, and robbed everyone who passed by them on the roads. So this reported to Amalek.
So this chapter 9 is not just painting Abimelech badly, it's painting the people of Shechem badly, because they followed an inferior claim to the throne. They then dealt treacherously with the descendants of Gideon, and then it shows you they're basically highway robbers now. They're terrorizing all the people who pass through the area. Verse 24 is the most important verse in that section, because it's going to tell you why everything happens next. What's the reason? That's right. This is their comeuppance, right? This is for what you did to God, and this is what you did to Gideon, and so you're going to be punished for this. And it's important that they remember that this is a consequence for their action. Now, for time's sake, because that was the first bell, we're going to speed through this next section. The honeymoon between Shechem and Abimelech does not last long. When you have dishonest, bad people who band together for bad purposes, these things kind of happen, right? There's some infighting, and two men by the name of Gel and Ebed decide that they're going to be, they can take care of Abimelech. Now that Abimelech has taken care of the sons of Gideon, they're going to take care of Abimelech, and they're going to rule in his place. And so what they try to do in verses 26 through 49 is they're going to try and trick Abimelech in coming out of his walled city. They're going to feign a defeat and a retreat, and they're going to draw him out, and they're going to slaughter him. The problem is their plans are betrayed. Abimelech knows. Abimelech is prepared, and he wipes them out. Sounds a lot like the fire coming out of Abimelech, right? He totally destroys this group of people. Now, for time's sake, we won't read through it, but I encourage you to read it because it is a very good story. But what I want to get you to is towards the end, because we need to know what happens to Abimelech. So we're going to jump down to verses 50 through 57. So Abimelech, who's mad, he's a petty tyrant who rules by fear, and now he's going to go and punish this other city, the city of Thebez, and he's going to go teach them a lesson, because he just learned at Shechem people were going to try and overthrow him. So now he's got to put people back in their place. So somebody read 50 through 57, please.
And Abimelech went to Thebez and camped against Thebez and captured it. There was a strong tower in the center of the city. All the men and women with all the leaders of the city fled there and shut themselves in.
All right, so everything that Jotham said was going to happen happens. If you did what was right, go and rejoice. Were they able to rejoice? He did not rejoice. Instead, the second part came true. If you did something wrong to Gideon and his family, then let this fire come out of Abimelech and consume you, and a fire comes out of you and consumes Abimelech. We're now in the city of Thebez, and it's Thebez. He's literally trying to burn a tower down. Fire, right? And these people are on the verge of dying. And like the story when we were in Deborah, remember he had the general that was fleeing, and he goes into a tent. And who was it who ultimately killed him? It was a woman. She drove a tent peg through his head while he was sleeping. She got him full of milk, and he was tired. He fell asleep, and she took care of business. Who is it that is the hero of this story? A woman. She drops a stone on his head, and he's dying. He knows he's dying. He doesn't want it to be remembered that he was killed by a woman, and so he calls people to pierce him through so that they can say technically he didn't die by her hands. But we all know he died by her hands. Okay, so that's the end of Abimelech. There is a descendant of Gideon, though. Who is that? Jotham. So Jotham is going to continue to live on, and through him, Gideon's legacy will live on. But their reign, their rule as a judge in Israel comes to a conclusion. And the next judge that's going to come in the story is a man by the name of Tola, which has 2 whole verses. Jer, which has 3 verses. And then we get into Jephthah, where there's a little more material there. So when we get a chance to pick this up, we'll start here in Tola. But appreciate your attendance and your participation and your prayers throughout this class. So I'll send this material out so you have it, and just thank